I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the podcast. This week I'm talking garden birds with Kate Risely, BirdWatch Organiser at the British Trust for Ornithology. Kate talks us through the trends that have occurred in our garden bird populations over the past 40 years, what and when to feed them, diseases that are on the rise, and how you can attract more birds in your garden. I started by asking Kate if she could explain her role at the BTO.
Yeah, sure. So I organise the BTO survey that's called Garden Birdwatch, and the BTO run a lot of different surveys which are getting people to record birds out in the countryside, in woodlands, in farmland, and obviously Garden Birdwatch is the survey where people record the birds in their gardens. And this is obviously really interesting to people because they want to know all about the birds that they're seeing every day, you know, from their own homes. But it's also really interesting for us to know about how birds use the space around our homes and how what we do affects them, because obviously this is where our actions have a really big impact on birds and wildlife.
So you don't actually need a garden?
The BTO run a lot of different surveys. So there's the breeding bird survey, there's the wetland bird survey, there's Bird Track, which is just about recording birds anywhere. And Garden Birdwatch is obviously about recording the birds in your garden. So I run, we have a little team of us, of people who get people involved in the survey. We run a membership. So people sign up and they pay £17 per year to keep the survey running, and we do a magazine which goes out to people all about garden birds, and obviously we process all the data that comes back in from those garden bird watchers. About 13,000 people across the country who record the birds in their garden and just send in weekly lists, and then we run a program of research using that data set to try and help answer some of these questions that are really interesting to us about how we're affecting these birds that we see.
I had some really interesting birds in my garden the other day and I'd never seen them before. They weren't particularly spectacular to look at, but there were certainly ones I hadn't seen before. So I looked on the internet and tried to do a bit of ID, and then I went to Twitter and asked for help. But I think they were warblers of some sort, and people were kind of saying, well, they could be chiff-chaffs, they could be this warbler and that warbler. And I thought, I'd be hopeless at this. But can anyone participate? Is that a barrier if you're not brilliant at bird watching?
No, certainly not. So we do sort of give lots of information to people about how to identify the common birds that they're likely to see. I have to say, telling the difference between a chiff-chaff and a willow warbler is actually quite difficult, and is, that's a sort of reasonable level of bird watching. And, I think what we expect from people what we ask people is that, can you record and identify the birds that you normally see in your garden? So that would normally be, your blue tits, your blackbirds, your chaffinches and greenfinches, those kind of things. And then obviously through doing the survey, getting involved, we actually give people a book when they join all about different birds. People do often end up learning a lot more and learning about things like, how to tell the difference between maybe these rarer species that might turn up. This time of year is when birds are migrating. So all these migrant birds tend to pass through and will pop up in gardens for a few weeks in the year when they're not normally in gardens at other times. So, they definitely do get a few unusual visitors at this time of year.
It was lovely to see them. But so if I wanted to take part, how would I actually do it in my garden?
So what we ask people to do is on a weekly basis. So over the course of a week, you don't have to do it every week. But a lot of people do it every week, or you can do it as and when, but just send in a list of the birds that you've seen that week. So you start the week on a Sunday, and as you go through the week, you might record the birds that you see. If you want to give a bit more detail, you can tell us how many you see together at one time. So obviously, if you see one blackbird every day, you won't count 7 blackbirds over the week, you'll just count it. You only saw one at a time. Whereas if you see 4 goldfinches together on a feeder, that would be 4. So that's the maximum that you know are in your garden at any one time. You can either do it just over the course of the week to say, this is what I've seen, or you can pick a particular time and say, right, Saturday morning I'm going to sit down for half an hour, and that will be my bird watch. And we really leave it up to people how much time they spend sort of looking at their garden, because obviously you can imagine people have very, very variable amounts of time available to do that. We only ask that people are consistent, so that they don't one week spend all day watching their bird feeders all day every day, and another week only spend half an hour, because obviously you're not really going to pick up a sense of changes in that garden from such different sort of amounts of effort you've put in. So whether people choose to spend a lot of time or a little time, it's just, make that the same every time they send a list in, because what we're really looking at is how, in one garden or in one type of garden, how the patterns change over the course of the year. So what kind of percentage of gardens might see these birds at one time of year compared to another time of year. So picking up those rhythms, really, that's what we're interested in doing.
Mm-hmm. I mean, in my garden, I think probably I have peak times of the day for the birds, say around 2:00. There's just nothing doing, and then earlier in the morning and later in the afternoon, they'll all come back in. Do you need to be fairly consistent with the time that you do it, or is there a bit of flexibility there?
Yeah. So when I record the birds in my garden, I tend to just keep an eye out the window whenever I'm in my living room, because I know that I spend roughly the same time in my living room one week to the next. So if I'm there early morning having my breakfast, that's when I'd look out the window and look at the birds. You don't have to get too worried really about what time you do it. If you feel like a good time to watch the birds or to record the birds that you see is when there are lots of birds there, then that seems like a good idea to do it at that time, and just to sort of do the same thing at different, in different weeks, so that what you're not doing is, 1 week you'll look out of your window when there are no birds there, and try and compare that to another week when you recorded at a time when there were lots of birds there. So
you mentioned about using the data that you collect. So why is that important, and how do you make use of that data?
Yeah, so we have a lot of people, sort of researchers working at the BTO who analyse the data, and we also collaborate with other organisations, with universities, academic institutions, to make that data set available. And essentially, the big questions that we're asking are along the lines of how are our own actions as gardeners, as people who are feeding the birds, how are they affecting our wildlife? So that's the big questions. But obviously that's broken down into a lot of very specific research topics. And one of the things we've been looking at a lot recently is the effects of bird feeding specifically. So, for example, so one thing that we've been looking at is over a long period of time, so over about 40 years, how has the food that we've been putting out been changing? How have the bird populations in our gardens been changing as a result of that food? And can we tell anything about how that's affected our bird populations in general? And there are definitely some indications that the food that we've put out has actually driven changes. For example, blackcaps, which is another kind of warbler. They use gardens in the winter. We're actually seeing a lot more of them than we did in previous decades. And actually, they've evolved a whole new migration route. So they come here from continental Europe in the winter. And we've shown using our data that that's actually been, one of the key drivers of that change has been due to actually bird food being put out in gardens. So that's been really interesting. That's a positive change. Another area of interest for us is more of a negative change, and it's about diseases. So we've looked at how birds transmit diseases at bird feeders, and how that's affected their populations as well. Greenfinches used to be a very common bird in gardens, but in the last decade or so, they've really declined due to disease. And we, using the data that people have sent to us, we think that they congregate at bird feeders, and that's actually been a really important factor in the spread of that disease, and has really had an effect on their populations. So that's a negative way in which bird feeding might have affected our birds, as well as the positive ways.
Yeah, I had that in my garden earlier this year. I'd never seen it before, and it was horrendous. Does that also affect sparrows?
Yes, they do. Sparrows do get trichomoniasis. They also get other diseases as well. So that's just one of the diseases that wild birds can get. Normally, birds have been living with these diseases for, obviously over evolutionary time, and even though individual birds might get sick, it doesn't necessarily affect their populations. So it's only really been in the greenfinches that we found this really surprising, a new disease coming into the population, causing an epidemic, and actually affecting their population very substantially.
When you say you're kind of monitoring the effects of garden bird feeders, are you asking people to record that information? And do the majority of people who take part in the Garden Bird Watch actually have bird feeders in their garden? Is that what you're finding?
Yes, the vast majority of people who take part in the survey do feed the birds. You don't have to feed the birds to record your garden birds, but it just so happens that obviously most of the people who send in records to us also feed their birds. And yes, we do ask people to just say, when they send in a list, what kinds of bird food that they put out.
Yeah. And if we are choosing to feed our birds, obviously there's the hygiene issue, but what are some of the best things that we can feed them? Do we need to be changing that depending on the season? And actually, is there anything we shouldn't be feeding?
In terms of things that you shouldn't feed, really the only things that are actively harmful are obviously processed foods, so things that people would eat that aren't good for us anyway. So anything with salt in is not a good thing. Anything processed, anything that's got that's soft, sticky fat at room temperature, because of that, not because it's necessarily bad for them to eat, but it gets onto their feathers. So any fats that put out have to be the hard fats at the temperature they'll be in the garden. They have to be solid and not sticky. So they're the real no-nos. Apart from that, really the things that we tend to focus on now are seeds, so natural seeds, so sunflower seeds, Niger seeds, and anything that's sort of quite energy rich and quite close to their natural food source. Peanuts, they're always a safe bet. And then in the winter, in particular, fat balls, fat pellets, those kind of things that are hard fats are really valuable energy source. In the breeding season, when birds have chicks that they're feeding, they tend to feed their chicks in nature. They feed their chicks on insects. Most birds do, because these are high in protein, and these are what the young birds need to grow and to grow their feathers. So sometimes people choose to put out dried mealworms and things like that are higher in protein in the breeding season. But the thing to remember about bird feeding is that all of these foods that we put in our gardens are always supplementary. Birds are generally feeding naturally as well, and they're coming into the gardens and making use of these food sources as and when they need them. People do think that the birds are only eating the food that they're putting out, and worry sometimes about making sure they've got a balanced diet. But this isn't really the same as feeding, your pet dog or your pet cat, where you're providing, the vast majority of that animal's food. They are feeding themselves on a natural diet of the things that they need. So in the summer, that will be insects. And they're really coming to use bird feeders for that additional supplementary food to top up their diet. So that's something to bear in mind, really. I think there's one other thing about seeds is that you can buy a lot of seed mixes, and there's some of them have got lots of seeds that birds really like, very high quality. Others tend to be maybe a bit bulked out with lower seeds that birds don't like as much, but are maybe cheaper to produce. And so really the way to assess this is when you feed the birds, do they sit on the feeder just throwing it all out onto the floor and only picking out 1 or 2 bits of seed? Or do they eat most of what's in the feeder? Because obviously it's a bit of a waste of money if you're putting the food out and it's got lots of kind of bulky cereals that they don't really eat. That's not really it's not harmful to the birds, but it's just something to be aware of if you're buying a seed mix. And I think the other thing that I mentioned about buying bird food is just being really aware that you're buying it from somewhere that's properly handling it and storing it, because things can go mouldy. So, for example, peanuts, you can get toxins when they go mouldy in storage. That's the most well-known problem, and these toxins are actually very, very poisonous to birds. So you wouldn't necessarily want to buy very cheap peanuts that that aren't from somewhere that takes care about storing them and testing them appropriately. So just we recommend that people buy their bird food from what we say is a reputable supplier, but I'm not really sure what that means in practice.
Yeah. So if I was feeding my birds, I feed my birds more in the winter. And then in the spring, like you said, I tend to put out sunflower hearts and then mealworms, that kind of thing. And then in the summer, I don't put as much out because it got to the point where I didn't think that they were visiting the feeders as much. But then I worry, have they come to rely on me a little bit for food? And if I stop and start, am I causing problems there?
Yeah, our data would definitely suggest that this doesn't cause any problems. We see how birds come into gardens to use feeders when they need them, and then they don't come into gardens when they don't need it. And birds never lose the ability to forage on natural foods. I would say really you get these crunch points in the winter when maybe everywhere's frozen, it's extremely cold, birds have extremely high energy use just to stay active, and that's when they might really need that extra food source just to make it through the day. I'd say in the summer, as a general rule, you don't really get to the point where birds are hanging on to survival in that way, and so need that extra bit of food. So no, I wouldn't worry too much about whether you put out food or not on a particular day, if the weather's nice and warm, because birds they'll learn about the different food sources and they'll use it if they need to.
Mm-hmm. We touched on it slightly earlier about the kind of diseases that birds can pick up at feeders. I think good hygiene around your bird feeders is something most people know about. Is there anything that you can add to that? What should we be doing, and what indeed should we do if we do find sick birds?
Yeah, so yes, you touched on hygiene, and obviously making sure that your feeders are clean. And the other thing that you also touched on is about maybe if you put food out and the birds aren't taking it, that's something to be aware of, because you don't really want to leave food uneaten in the feeder for days and days at a time. So always putting out the amount of food that's going to be eaten within a couple of days maximum. So really tailoring the food that you're putting out to the rate that they're eating it at the time. Another key thing about hygiene is also to think about the area where the feeders are, because obviously you can clean your feeders, but you can't really clean ground underneath them. And if that sort of dropped food is building up on the ground all the time and it isn't probably an area that you can clean, possibly if it's on paving slabs you might be able to clean it, but if it's over soil you can't clean it. So if that's the case, it's a really good idea to rotate your feeders around to different areas of the garden, or have several feeding spots and stop feeding at different spots at different times, just to give that area on the ground a bit of a break, because that's where birds can really transmit diseases to each other, or diseases can build up under the feeder. So that's something to that it would be really good if more people were conscious of this good practice. In terms of if you find a dead bird, certainly if you have a good reason to suspect that that's disease related. So obviously if you find a dead bird underneath a window, you might think, well, it's probably it's likely to have hit a window. Whereas if you see a sick bird or a bird that's lethargic in your garden around the feeder, and then maybe find a dead bird, not long after that, you would probably assume that it was a sick bird. We generally advise to stop feeding, to take the feeders down, to obviously give them a good clean, give it a little while to allow the birds to disperse, because it's not really the case that the birds are getting diseases always from the feeder. They're giving it to each other while they are congregating at feeders. So, like I said, most of the time, birds can adapt really well to not having a particular food source for a little while. So we always advise just to stop feeding for a little bit, just break that cycle where you've got a sick bird that's hanging around at the feeder, which probably hangs around at the feeder because if it's sick, because it's finding it hard to forage in other places if it's not got much energy. So it's really, try and break that cycle of the birds transmitting it to each other. And then obviously then reintroduce feeding. And if you get more sick birds around the feeder or find more dead birds, then, stop feeding again. But hopefully once you reintroduce feeding, you won't see these problems. And also we have a project called Garden Wildlife Health, which is a website. And on that website, people can submit records of any birds or animals that they've seen. So it's not just birds. We collect records for amphibians and reptiles and hedgehogs and all these other things that you might see in your garden. So you can report anything that you've seen, and you can also, if you found anything, a dead bird, you can actually say that you have a dead bird, you found a dead bird, and then these reports go off to the Zoological Society of London, the wildlife vets there, and they might request the carcass. Mm-hmm. Obviously, if it's not been too long, and they obviously get back to you straight away and say, okay, please send in the carcass. I would say it's very important not to send a dead bird to anyone unless they specifically ask for it, which is just a good rule about life in general, I think. So we definitely don't want people sending in birds without, if they're not expecting it.
Unsolicited birds, no.
Yeah. So many in my time I've had. But yes, you can say to the vets at Cell that if you found a dead bird, and they will say, okay, if they think it's worth investigating, they can ask for you to send it in to them, and then we'll do a post-mortem, and obviously they'll report back to you to say the cause of death, if they can find it out, particularly if it was a specific disease. They can then give you very specific advice about what actions to take. So if they say it was this disease, or if it didn't look like a disease, or what the cause of death was, then obviously that will help you decide how to deal with, what actions to take in your garden. And also, all this information is collected and collated together, and so we can get a picture. We can monitor outbreaks of disease across the country using this method. So we do ask people to, even if they haven't found a dead bird, and they've just seen signs of disease in their gardens, to report it on the Garden Wildlife Health website, because that's really useful for us.
Okay. You did actually talk about their windows there, and they are awful things sometimes for birds, and I think probably mirrors in the garden are a problem. Is there anything you can do to stop the birds flying into windows?
Only really the very common sense solutions. Don't put a feeder very close to a window. Just make the birds, give them the best chance possible to not fly into the window by, for example, making sure that there's things around the window. So maybe if you can put things inside the window, try and block any line of sight through the window to another window. So because what birds will try and do is, if they can see sky through a window, they'll think that it's an open space, so they'll try and fly straight through it. So it's really hard. It depends on the layout of your room, but try and avoid that situation. Yeah, putting things around the outside of the window, maybe sort of plants or shrubs that maybe birds would fly onto, because obviously if a bird is very close to a window, they can see it. tends to be when they try and fly at the window from a distance. They can't tell when they start to fly towards it that there's something there. So just trying to break up the environment, both inside the window and maybe directly outside the window, and not putting a feeder. So a feeder actually on the window is sometimes okay, because obviously the birds are close enough to be able to see that it's a pane of glass. It's when you've got a feeder maybe 2 meters away or 3 meters away, it's close enough that they're close to the window, but far enough away for them to get a bit of speed up. So trying to really have the feeders, quite far away from the window is the best advice, really.
So if we don't want to necessarily put out bird feed or feeders of any sort, can you think of sort of 1 or 2 top tips, especially for people who enjoy their gardens? What would be your best bet to get more birds into your garden?
So a couple of top tips, really. The first one would be having, obviously, berry-producing sort of bushes and plants. So rowan, a lot of cotoneaster bushes, anything that's got berries, apple trees, any kind of fruit tree, really. So these will attract birds in the autumn and winter, especially if you then leave, obviously, the fruits to fall. So that's a food source for birds. Obviously, water. This is very much a common sense thing. If you have a bird bath or any kind of watery feature in your garden, that's going to attract the birds. I'd say the thing that is perhaps a bit that springs to mind slightly less is just having very dense vegetation structure in your garden. So really thick evergreen. I mean, the best thing really is ivy. And I know a lot of gardeners maybe don't like ivy, but ivy is just an amazing plant for birds because it just provides, they want somewhere to hide, they want somewhere to shelter. In the winter, they need these structures, they need these shelters, and in the breeding season, they use them for breeding. And ivy also has the benefits that you've got those very late flowers that are amazing for pollinators, and so you get a lot of insect life in your garden, which is obviously amazing. That it's a food source for birds, and then you've got the berries as well. So that kind of really thick structure, climbers, anything where the birds might nest and hide is really a great thing to have for birds.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'm a fan of ivy all round, really, so that works for me. So you were talking earlier about a few of the trends that you'd spotted. So just to finish up, could you maybe give us a sort of overall view of maybe the past 40 years and what trends you've seen?
Oh gosh.
Yeah, just to summarise the last 40 years, if you could, in a couple of sentences.
40 years. So it used to be to put out things like peanuts and maybe, those coconut shells filled with fat. And those really only appeal to a very few birds. So you'd get your blue tits and your great tits. And that was what people thought of as garden birds. Whereas over the last few decades, people are putting out such a wide range of foods and more natural kinds of seeds, and that's appealed to things like greenfinches, goldfinches, redpolls, all of these things that weren't really garden birds in the past, and now they've really adapted to using gardens, using human food sources. At the same time, we've obviously seen a lot of declines in things that used to be garden birds, and one that springs to mind is spotted flycatcher. A lot of our migrant birds. So you touched at the start on these warblers that you'd seen. So you've got chiffchaffs, willow warblers. Obviously, we've got swallows and swifts and house martins and all these things that we're used to seeing around our gardens. And a lot of these birds that migrate tend to be in trouble, and we're seeing those big declines in those. So that's not not a great thing to see. Obviously, it's very sad. There are things we can do to help in terms of providing nesting sites, for things like house sparrows, which are declining, for things like house martins. It's very difficult to convince swifts to nest in buildings, to nest in new sites, but providing swift sites is something that people can do. So those are some changes, things that people can do around their homes as well.
Mm-hmm. Can you also answer a question I might have about magpies, which is I have people who sort of talk to me about magpies and they say, oh, I hate magpies. They eat all the songbird chicks. And, you know, is there any truth in that, or are they just opportunists that are kind of proliferating because there are other birds declining?
So there's truth in the fact that magpies do obviously eat chicks. That is one of their food sources. So if you really don't like the fact that they do that, then that's obviously a valid reason not to like them, because that is something that they do. There isn't any evidence on a national scale that increases in magpies or sparrowhawks, all these other birds, are driving the population declines of smaller birds. We actually did some research a few years ago where we looked at, on particular, it broke it down to particular sites, and there was no evidence that at a site level increases in birds such as magpies would actually make smaller bird populations decline. So the fact that magpie populations have increased and smaller birds have declined, and that's happened over the same, time period, these are driven by different things. So we can't find any evidence to say that they are causing national scale declines in other bird populations. These are obviously, it is normal. It's very normal for nests of birds to be predated. Obviously, most birds make several nesting attempts in the breeding season. They'll obviously breed over, the course of many years. They expect, in an evolutionary sense, they expect that most breeding attempts will not be successful, and they are adapted to living with predator populations. This is the normal way of things. So that is normal. Obviously, it's not very pleasant, and if you see it happening, it's obviously quite natural to be upset by, if you actually see this happening in front of your eyes. But people tend to make a link between what they're seeing in front of their eyes and national population declines, and we've not found that link to be there.
Okay. Good, thank you. I like magpies, so I'm pleased to hear that. Brilliant. All right, well, so Kate, if people want to join up to the Skeep, to Garden Birdwatch, how would they go about it?
Yeah, so they can go onto the BTO website, British Trust for Ornithology, and just search for the BTO, search for BTO Garden Birdwatch, and they can go onto our website and join in. They could, like I said, it's £17 for the year, but you do get a book, a really great book on garden wildlife when you join, and you get a magazine, and you get to start entering the data on your garden and joining that community of garden bird watchers. So people can join online, or they can give us a call.
Well, thank you, Kate, for sharing your expertise. And if you'd like to find out how you can take part in the Garden Birdwatch or more about the BTO, I've put links in the show notes. Kate would like to credit the following people with the research she mentioned. The black cap migration research and research on the effect of bird feeding was led by Dr. Kate Plummer at BTO. The garden disease research was led by Dr. Becky Lawson at ZSL. The research on how predators affect bird populations was led by Dr. Stuart Newson at BTO. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll catch you next Tuesday. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you'll also find my blog and a sign-up form for the newsletter, which gives you a weekly roundup of content, plus the inside scoop on things like upcoming guests. Or you can subscribe wherever you normally get your podcasts. Email me with comments and feedback at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, Roots and All, Facebook, Roots and All UK, and Instagram, Roots and All Pod. But please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support my work, because if you like what I do, please help me to continue doing it. Even if you make a one-off donation of £1, trust me, it all helps, and I will be immensely grateful. So please go to Patreon and search for Roots and All.